Chapter 31. Play for your supper. Seeing a dust trail appear down the road, Rand and Matt head to the hedgerow to hide. The wind whipped up the dust, making Rand glad for the scarf around his neck. A farmer had given the scarves to the boys. He was a kind man in a gruff way. He told them he didn't want to know what they ran from, but he had scarves that belonged to his boys who have more, so they're welcome to them. But please, forget they ever met. These are hard times. Rand treasured the scarf. Kindness was in short supply since leaving Whitebridge. 7 mounted men in armour with swords and spears rode past, and Rand wondered if they were soldiers or merchants' guards. As one scanned the hedgerow, Matt clutched his dagger. He always did that now whenever he felt threatened, forgetting that he had a bow. They waited until the sound of hooves had passed before heading back to the road, and Rand mused that they weren't after them. For days after leaving Whitebridge, Rand found himself looking back down the road for pursuit, but also in hope that Tom was safe and catching up to them. He never did, though. Most travellers they saw were farmers, peddlers and merchants' wagons, most heading in the direction of Camelin. Occasionally they got a ride in a farmer's cart for a couple of miles, but mostly they walked, and whenever riders approached they hid from sight in case it was a fade. The first village they came to resembled Emmons Field. Rand thought he might find Tam in one of the houses. Matt had to pull him into moving, and they spent that night under some bushes, filling their stomach with stream water to stave off the hunger. Rand slept fitfully, and he could hear Matt muttering and tossing in his sleep. There had been many nights like that, their cloaks barely protecting them from the cold and rain. They had the money for food and a room in an inn, but for only one night, and it would take much of their coin, so they saved it for emergencies. One afternoon, when there was nothing in sight but bushes and the sky threatening rain, Rand suggested selling the dagger. Matt was furious. "Why are you so anxious to sell it? I found it after all. You ever think I might like to keep it? For a while, anyway. If you want to sell something, sell that bloody sword." Rand replied, "My father gave me this sword. It was his. I wouldn't ask you to sell something your father gave you. Blood and ashes, Matt, do you like going hungry? Anyway, who would I sell a sword to around here? What would a farmer want with it? That ruby alone would fetch enough to get us to Camelin with a meal and bed every night, maybe even in a carriage. Do you like sleeping on the ground every night, hungry and tired from walking?" He glared at Matt, who returned his stare. Finally, Matt shrugged, then asked who would they sell it to. A farmer would have to pay them in chickens, and that's if they weren't accused of stealing it. Rand nodded and admitted he was right. He didn't mean to snap, but he's hungry and his feet hurt. Matt told him he felt the same, and they carried on walking wearily. Matt had tried his hand at stealing eggs and milking a lone cow, but most farms had dogs to ward off such attempts. Once they'd been chased by the dogs up a tree, and it had been hours until they gave up. Rand preferred to approach a farm in broad daylight. Many farmers were nervous about strangers in these times. An hour or so of chopping wood or hauling water could earn a meal and a barn or haystacks to sleep in. Yet it was time that the fade had to catch up with them. Rand was starting to worry about Matt too. One day while they mucked out a stable, Matt had begun muttering about what they knew about the farmer. Rand exclaimed, what did the farmer know about them? What they do know is that they were offered a roast lamb meal and a real bed. Matt glared at the farmer as he worked and told Rand, "He's up to something, I tell you. See the way he wouldn't meet my eyes? Why are they so friendly to a couple of wanderers they'd never met before today? Tell me that." Exasperated, Rand told him they remind the farmer's wife of her grandsons, so stop worrying. When they finished their task, the farmer met them, leaning on a quarterstaff, and told them they can't stay as their 4 large grandsons were visiting. His wife gave Rand a bundle with food for 2 meals, and he took it, saying he understood. Rand thought it could have been worse. 3 days earlier, Matt's side-eye looks at the farmer whilst they were working got them chased off the farm completely. Matt had started back, fumbling with his quiver until Rand caught him, calling him crazy. Rand wondered if it was worth trying farms anymore. Matt's behaviour and suspicion was getting worse and causing more and more problems. A solution finally came when they arrived at the Grinwell farm. Master Grinwell and his wife had 9 children, the eldest only a year younger than the boys. The farmer probably didn't need any more hands, but he'd looked at the state of the boys and took pity. Mistress Grinwell insisted they borrow her husband's spare clothes while she washed theirs, and reminded Rand of Mistress Althea. Even Matt lost some of his tension when she smiled at him. The oldest daughter, Else, was a problem though. Dark-haired and pretty, she watched Rand work while her parents weren't looking. Rand began to think it wouldn't be Matt who got them kicked out this time. The younger children were a blessing. Matt's weariness always eased when children were around. After supper, Mistress Grinwell began to mend the tears in their clean clothing, while Matt juggled for the children, making them laugh as he pretended to drop a ball, then catch it last minute. Even the adults laughed and clapped. Rand took out Tom's flute with a pang of sadness. That always happened when he handled the instrument. He began to play the songs Tom taught him, as the family stamped their feet and clapped along in time. When he finished, Elle said she'd never heard anything so beautiful. Mistress Grinwell stopped sewing and gave Rand a long look as he was putting the flute away. He panicked at the thought of being accused of dallying with their daughter, and began to play again as a distraction long into the evening. Eventually, Master Grinwell told them it's time for sleep, and he's paid good money in an inn for such entertainment, worse sometimes. His wife declared they deserved proper beds as a reward, and would have Else's, and she would sleep with her. Rand gave Mistress Grinwell a relieved and grateful look as they thanked the couple. The next day Matt teased him about Else, but Rand was too lost in thought to care. He pondered over Master Grinwell's comments about playing in inns, so when they arrived in the village of Arion, he spoke to the innkeeper of the only inn. He played a couple of songs while Matt showed off his juggling, and in return they were offered room and board. Rand slept better than he had since leaving the Spray, and the next morning they hitched a lift with the farmer who'd stayed overnight. That became the new routine of their travels. They'd reach the next village, and if there was more than one inn, they would let the innkeepers bid for their services. The next day they would usually find someone whose cart or wagon they could catch a ride from. They were starting to think their troubles were behind them, until they arrived in the town of Four Kings.
Thanks for listening. Please like, share and subscribe and help get a new channel off the ground. Thank you.